So let's talk more about the economic effects of COVID-19 and how it will help accelerate global fanaticism. So a lot of experts on economics are saying that we are heading towards an inevitable recession, something either like 2008 or worse than 2008, and the case is most likely going to be the latter. And by economists, I'm talking about people from the former finance minister of Greece, Yanis Varoufakis, to the economic advisors for Angela Merkel, and numerous others. They are saying pretty much the same things, that we are headed towards a recession. Yanis Varoufakis wrote in a recent article that we are headed towards a situation actually a lot worse than what the world saw in 08, in 09, and in 2010 with the crash of the Greek economy. So either way you look at it, we're not headed towards a possibly good scenario. The situation is going to be either bad or really bad. And in the case for Europe, I'd say it's probably going to be worse. Varoufakis, he makes an interesting parallel. He says that the one thing that really helped Europe was the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve flooded European banks with American dollars, and that helped to keep Europe economically afloat. And he poses the question, is the United States Federal Reserve going to do the same thing when Europe crashes again? And his answer is most likely not, because of the protectionist paradigm of the Trump administration. So the situation for Europe is most likely going to be a lot worse. And the ideological consequences of this economic crisis is also going to be a lot worse than what we have been seeing in the last decade. One thing that we notice about the rises of ideological beliefs and ideological movements is that they don't come overnight. It seems that way to those who are not informed, but they don't come overnight. They work in incremental steps. And so every major event is a step. Every major event is a step towards the greater global crisis. And we can look at the last decade and we can see these steps. 08 was a step. 09, when the European banks said they couldn't lend any more money, and so they had to go to the International Monetary Fund, that was another step. Bailing out the Greek banks by flooding German and French money into Greece and further enslaving Greece to debt and bringing much more problems politically to Europe, that was another step. The migrant crisis of 2015, that was another major step. And so coronavirus, or COVID-19, this is another step. And we are quickly transitioning into the next step, which will be the economic effects of COVID-19, which will then in turn lead to another step, which is going to be the political effects of that. Because what happened in 2010 with the economic crisis in Europe was that the ideas of separatism and nationalism became strong. For example, we saw the quick surge in Catalonian separatism in 2010. Before 2010, Catalonian separatism had a following, but it was pretty much insignificant. It was considered to be on the fringe. In 2010, all of that changed. Why? Because of the economic effects. Spain was one of the worst countries hit in the economic crisis of that time. It was Not as bad as Greece, but it was close to Greece. And because of the high unemployment, people in Catalonia sought to be separated from Madrid, because Catalonia has been the wealthiest region, the wealthiest province of Spain. And Catalonia did not want to be dragged by the rest of Spain, because Catalonia had the money. And the other thing that we saw was popularity for political parties like the neo-Nazi Greek Golden Dawn Party, which is still a very popular party and is using, or has been using, the current wave of migrants trying to enter Greece in order to boost the popularity for its party, for itself. 2015, we saw the migrant crisis, and that led to a surge for numerous right-wing parties throughout Europe. I've said this many times, but I'll repeat it again. We saw the rise of the Golden Dawn, the AfD. We saw and this continued on all the way up to 2017, when we saw parties like the AfD win substantial seats in parliament. The AfD in Germany, the Freedom Party in the Netherlands, the Freedom Party in Austria, also in 2019, I want to say, we also saw the rise of the other right-wing party in the Netherlands, the Forum for Democracy Party. And this is all due to the migrant situation. So that was a step. The migrant crisis of 2015 was a step. So now we're experiencing the next step, which is COVID-19. And this is going, I got my finger in the way, this is going to make things much more intense. It's going to further exasperate political fanaticism. I'm talking nationalism. I'm also talking separatism. I'm also talking things like Marxism as well, far-left socialism. Because one thing that we saw, and Yanis Varoufakis talks about this in his book, Adults in the Room, which I believe is his latest book. One thing that we saw in 2008, 2009, and 2010 was how a lot of left-wing ideas became very popular, and that was reflected in the rise of the Occupy Wall Street movement. So global fanaticism has been rising in the last decade, and we are only seeing it grow in steps, depending on, whatever particular major event takes place. And one thing that I've noticed about Europe is that Europe is a politically very polarizing place. We may not think that as Americans, because we have maybe now things have changed, but for a long time, I think probably since the end of the Second World War, or maybe, since the post-World War II era, I think we as Americans have seen Europe in a very romantic way. We think of Italy as this romantic place with wonderful food and wine, and France, makeup and cosmetics, and we think it's all just so beautiful and wonderful. Italian fishermen singing by the docks under the twilight of the sun. And that's all a romantic view, but once you get past the tourism and all that, Europe is a very polarized place. I was in Italy from the middle of September to early October 2019. I was in Italy, and everyone I met, except for one person, hated the EU. I met a lot of Catholics when I was in Italy. Pretty much everyone I hung out with was Catholic. The only person that I met who liked the EU was an atheist who was also Antifa. And no, I wasn't conspiring with Antifa. I met her at a museum for ancient archaeology in Italy, and we had a nice long conversation about politics. But other than that, everyone I met hated the EU. I'm talking from the taxi cab drivers to every Catholic that I had met. I met a lot of nuns. They all hated the EU. They all hated the EU's immigration policy. I met priests. They hated the EU. I met one priest. He hated the EU. But I also met a number of monks, and they also all hated the EU, and they all loved Salvini. So you can feel the intensity when you're in Europe. I went to Spain in 2015, and this was during the height of the migrant crisis. And this was in, I want to say April of 2015. And it was during the whole migrant situation. And I didn't see a lot of migrants, but I could see the economic diminishment. And you saw a lot of abandoned restaurants. You saw businesses that were empty, businesses that were closed. They were only open temporarily. And when I say abandoned restaurants, I mean that they were closed for pretty much the whole year except for tourism season because there's no money. So you could feel the economic depression and you can feel the political polarization when you go to these southern European countries. And it's not a romantic place. It's a dark place. You can feel the darkness when you're there. And that darkness was due to the economic decline. It was also due to anger towards immigration. You can feel it. And there's a lot of hatred in Europe. People may not see that immediately, but there's a lot of hatred, not just between European and migrant, but European and other Europeans. During the bailout of the Greek banks, where did that money come from? It came from France, it came from Germany, it came from the Netherlands. And who paid for that? Who paid for that? Well, the Greek taxpayers had to pay for it, and they're still paying for it ultimately. But the actual money that went to bail out Greece, it came from the taxpayers. It was paid for by the taxpayers in Germany, in the Netherlands, in France. And so what did that cause? It caused a rift between the northern countries and the southern countries. There is a politician in Germany's far-right party, the AfD. His name is Alexander Gauland. And Alexander Gauland, a number of years ago, he said that Germany, the Netherlands, Austria, these countries are culturally connected, unlike those irresponsible cultures of Spain and Greece. We, the Germanic peoples, we are a responsible people. We take care of our money. We are economically and fiscally responsible. And so you can see the differences in mentalities, and you can see, you can feel, you can hear the rift between these countries. There's a lot of anger and animosity. And so it's not going to take that many serious situations, serious economic situations, to watch Europe implode into a violent conflict. And I'm not talking about, a race war. I'm not talking about what's the name of that book, The Field of the Saints or whatever. I'm not talking about some 4chan fantasy. I'm talking about an actual war between European countries. It's not that far off. And if you think that that's impossible, then your mentality is like these women that read novels and want to go travel all day because they think that Europe is this perpetually peaceful place. But we forget the fact that, Spain had a civil war in the 1930s. And the entirety of Europe was ravaged by war, with the exception of Switzerland and, maybe some other places. But the entirety of Europe, the whole of Europe, was ravaged by war less than 100 years ago. And not too long before that, there was another war, the First World War. And so if you look at, the political effects of what happened in 2010, the political effects were very real. So if Europe has another recession and it's worse than what happened in 2008 and 2009 and in 2010, then imagine the political ramifications of that. Imagine how people are going to turn towards political fanaticism. It's going to be very scary. And I think that we are headed towards some pretty moribund times. And soon we may just see the last beautiful summer of Europe. And I reference what happened before the eruption of the First World War. They say that Europe had the most beautiful summer before World War I, and it felt like war was impossible. And I feel that we are going to experience that atmosphere yet again. Anyway, you guys just heard some theology.